I stood in Principal Vance's office, the fluorescent lights humming with a sickening buzz that seemed to amplify the pounding in my temples. Tears burned behind my eyes, hot and humiliating, as two smug parents sat across from me, dissecting my life with surgical cruelty. They told me I was a failure. They told me my daughter, Sophie, deserved to be banned from school, not because of what she did, but because of who I was. A single mother, a damaged woman, who couldn't raise a child alone. They looked at my scuffed heels and my frantic expression and saw a victim they could crush. They had no idea that with one phone call, I was about to bring a man into that room who would make them regret every venomous word they had just spoken. But to understand why that phone call was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, you have to understand the walls I built. My name is Vivian. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent the better part of 3 decades constructing emotional fortifications so high that love couldn't climb them. But as I eventually learned, when you build walls that high, pain gets trapped inside with you. I learned early that men were liabilities, volatile variables in the equation of life that always resulted in a negative sum. My biological father, Robert, was my first teacher in this harsh curriculum. I was 13 years old, an awkward age where you're desperate for approval, when I found my mother, Evelyn, sobbing on the cold linoleum of our kitchen floor. She was clutching a stack of credit card statements and a handwritten letter that smelled faintly of a perfume she didn't own. Robert didn't just cheat. He executed a complete exit strategy. He abandoned us with a precision that felt almost military. He vanished into the arms of a 20-something paralegal, leaving us struggling in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that hissed but never heated. He started fresh, erasing us like a corrupted file on a hard drive. While my mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, I wore everything secondhand, my clothes smelling of other people's detergents, and I learned lesson number 1. A man's love is conditional, temporary, and always comes with an expiration date. When my mother married Arthur Sterling 3 years after Robert left, I was 16 and absolutely furious. Arthur was everything Robert wasn't, which, in my twisted teenage logic, made him even more dangerous. He wasn't just a stepfather. He was a titan of industry. Arthur was a tech tycoon, a man who had made his fortune building the server infrastructure that powered half the state's internet. He was quiet, analytical, and wildly successful. He didn't drive a flashy sports car like Robert did before the bankruptcy. He was driven in armored SUVs. He didn't shout. He spoke in low, measured tones that commanded boardrooms. He had money, power, and influence, and that terrified me. To me, Arthur Sterling was a ticking time bomb wrapped in an expensive suit. I saw his wealth not as security, but as a mechanism for control. I was convinced he was just a more polished, more efficient version of the poison that had destroyed my mother once already. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his cutting-edge laptops or his offers to pay for private coding camps. I wanted nothing from him, so I rejected him, completely. When he bought me a car for my 17th birthday, a safe, reliable sedan with the latest safety features, I left the keys on the kitchen counter and walked to school in the rain. I saw the hurt in his eyes, a flicker of confusion behind his wire-rimmed glasses, but I didn't care. I was protecting myself. When he tried to pay for my college tuition, offering me a full ride without student loans, I refused. I took out predatory loans with high interest rates just to prove a point. The day I turned 18, I moved out of his pristine, smart home mansion and into a drafty studio apartment, determined to never look back. I met Julian when I was 23. I was working double shifts at a downtown cafe, smelling of roasted beans and exhaustion, trying to pay off those college loans I had stubbornly taken instead of accepting Arthur's help. Julian was 25, a musician with tousled hair and a smile that looked like trouble. He was charming in that effortless, chaotic way that should have been my first red flag. He was a producer and a guitarist, always talking about his sound, his next big record deal, and how he was just one connection away from stardom. He noticed me. That was enough. After years of building walls, after convincing myself I was safer in isolation, having someone actually see me, not as the angry stepdaughter of a billionaire, but just as Vivian felt like oxygen after drowning. He would wait for me after my shifts, sitting at the corner table scribbling lyrics on napkins. He brought me wildflowers he'd picked from the park, telling me I was his muse, even when I was exhausted and covered in coffee stains. He made me laugh. He made the silence of my apartment feel less heavy. We moved in together after 6 months. It felt reckless, bohemian, and perfect. He would wait for me after my shifts, sitting at the corner table scribbling lyrics on napkins. He brought me wildflowers he'd picked from the park, telling me I was his muse, even when I was exhausted and covered in coffee stains. He made me laugh. He made the silence of my apartment feel less heavy. We moved in together after 6 months. It felt reckless, bohemian, and perfect. For the first time since Robert left, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, my data set was wrong. Maybe not all men were poison. Maybe I could have something real, something built on passion rather than transactions. When I found out I was pregnant 2 years into our relationship, the reality of our situation crashed into the fantasy. I was terrified, but hopeful. Julian seemed excited at first, in a vague, abstract way. He talked about writing a song for the baby, about how a child would deepen his art. He talked about getting a bigger apartment, maybe a loft where he could have a studio. I believed him. I let myself imagine a future where I wasn't repeating my mother's story. But pregnancy changes things. It strips away the romantic veneer and reveals the structural integrity of a relationship. It demands sacrifice, not just sentiment. As my belly grew, Julian's enthusiasm waned. He started staying out later, claiming late-night studio sessions that stretched into mornings. He'd come home smelling like stale beer and cheap perfume, muttering excuses about networking and finding the vibe. He stopped asking about doctor's appointments. He stopped touching me, and when I was 7 months along, swollen and exhausted, waddling around the apartment trying to assemble a crib by myself, I found the texts. They were to a backup singer named Sierra. He wasn't even sorry when I confronted him. He looked at me with a detached, bored expression, strumming his guitar as if I were interrupting a rehearsal. He said I'd changed. He said I was always tired, that I had lost my spark, and that the impending responsibility was choking his creativity. "I need space, Viv," he said, packing his vintage leather duffel bag. "I'm an artist. I can't be tied down to a domestic life. I'm not ready for this." He walked out the door, guitar case in hand, leaving me standing in the nursery I had painted yellow. Just like Robert, just like every man I'd ever trusted. He didn't look back. Sophie was born 6 weeks later. Julian wasn't there. He never met her. He never sent a dime for diapers. He simply erased us from his life, blocking my number and moving to the coast to chase his dream. That's when lesson number 2 became carved into stone, reinforcing the foundation Robert had laid. Every man will eventually betray you. It's not a question of if, it's when. And in my grief, I felt a twisted sense of validation regarding Arthur. I convinced myself I had been right to reject him at 16. I had been right to refuse his help. Because this is what men do. They promise, they charm, they occupy your space, and then they destroy you. For the next 9 years, Arthur kept trying. He was relentless in his quiet, digital way. He sent checks that I tore up and mailed back in pieces. He set up a trust fund for Sophie that I refused to acknowledge. He called on birthdays, and I let it go to voicemail, listening to his calm, steady voice later in the dark but never returning the call. He told my mother to tell me he was proud of me, proud of how I was raising Sophie alone. I rolled my eyes and told my mother to stop playing messenger. I was so determined to prove I didn't need a man that I locked myself away from the only one who ever tried to be there, convinced that his kindness was just a prelude to another abandonment. I didn't know then that the walls I built to keep him out were actually locking me in a cage, one that my daughter would eventually pay the price for. Then came the crisis that shattered everything. The storm that would eventually force me to confront the past I had buried so deep. My daughter, Sophie, was 9 years old. She was the best part of me, kind, wildly creative, and possessing a gentle intelligence that often made her seem older than she was. She had my eyes, but she had a spirit that was entirely her own. For years, it had been just the two of us against the world. A small, fortified unit of love. I thought I had protected her. I thought my hard work and hypervigilance were enough to shield her from the cruelty of the world. I was wrong. The trouble didn't start with a bang. It started with a slow, corrosive drip. Sophie began coming home from school with her shoulders slumped, the light in her eyes dimming a little more each day. At first, she said it was nothing, just playground stuff, but then the silence grew heavier. She stopped drawing. She stopped singing in the shower. And then, on a rainy Tuesday, she came home crying for the 4th day in a row, her backpack dragging on the floor like a burden she could no longer carry. The bullying had started: small whispers, giggles, exclusion at recess, standard cruelty, I told myself. The kind every kid navigates. But it escalated with terrifying speed. The architect of this misery was a girl named Chloe Thorne. Chloe was the daughter of two of the most arrogant, high-status parents in our school district. People who treated the public school system like their own private kingdom. Chloe didn't just push or tease. She was cruel in a way that felt calculated, a behavior clearly learned from adults who discussed people's worth over dinner tables. She was a mean girl in training, polished and predatory. Every single day, she would corner Sophie by the lockers or in the cafeteria line and whisper the same venomous narrative, chipping away at my daughter's identity. "You don't have a daddy because your mommy is a bad woman," Chloe would hiss, making sure her friends could hear. "That's why he left. That's why no one wants you. My mom says women like yours are broken." She was weaponizing my single status. She was taking the deepest wound I had spent decades hiding, the shame of being abandoned, the fear that I was unlovable, and she was carving it into my daughter's heart. It wasn't just bullying, it was psychological warfare. Chloe made Sophie feel like her existence was a mistake, a result of my failure. I tried to intervene. I emailed teachers, who gave me vague assurances about monitoring the situation. I tried to empower Sophie, telling her that families come in all shapes and sizes, that we were enough. Sophie tried to be strong. She tried to ignore the snickers when she walked into class. She tried to focus on her schoolwork. But how strong can a 9-year-old be when she is being told daily that she is the product of a bad woman? One evening, I found Sophie sitting on her bed, staring at a photo of the two of us. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. "Mom," she asked, her voice trembling, "is it true? Did my dad leave because you did something wrong? Is that why we're alone?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It took the air right out of my lungs. I hugged her, rocking her back and forth, promising her that it wasn't true, that her father left because he was weak, not because we were bad. But as I held her, I felt a cold, simmering rage building in my chest. I wasn't just angry at Chloe. I was angry at the world that taught little girls that their worth was tied to a man. And deep down, a terrifying thought took root. Maybe I couldn't protect her from this alone. But I pushed that thought away. I had to handle this. I was her mother. I was all she had. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks later, on the day of the district science fair. This was supposed to be Sophie's day of triumph. Despite the bullying, she had poured her heart into her project. It was a complex model of a sustainable, self-powering city, a green metropolis, she called it. It was intricate, brilliant, and surprisingly advanced for a 4th grader. She had used recycled circuit boards and tiny solar panels she'd scavenged from old calculators. I watched her that morning as she carefully packed the model into the car. For the first time in weeks, she was smiling. She was proud. She wore her best dress and tied her hair back, looking like a little scientist, ready to change the world. "I'm going to win, Mom," she said, her eyes shining. "I'm going to show them I'm smart." I dropped her off at the gymnasium, kissing her forehead. You are brilliant, Sophie. Don't let anyone dim your light. I had to go to work for a few hours but promised to be back for the judging at noon. I drove away feeling a rare sense of optimism. That optimism died at 10:30 a.m. According to the witnesses, other students who were too scared to step in, Chloe Thorne had approached Sophie's table while the judges were on a break. She didn't come to look at the project. She came to destroy. Chloe stood over Sophie's green metropolis, looking at the intricate wiring and the carefully painted structures. She laughed. A cold, sharp sound that cut through the chatter of the gym. Did your mom help you with this? Chloe asked loudly. Oh wait, she works all the time because she's poor, and you don't have a dad to help you build things. My dad says fatherless girls don't have the brains for science. You're just pretending. Sophie tried to ignore her. She tried to stand in front of her project, to shield it with her body. Leave me alone, Chloe, she said, her voice shaking. It's trash anyway, Chloe sneered, just like your family. And then, with a casual, malicious swipe of her arm, Chloe shoved the model off the table. The sound of it shattering on the gymnasium floor was sickening. Weeks of work, the tiny solar panels, the fragile structures, all of it crunched into plastic shrapnel. The room went silent. Sophie stared at the wreckage of her hard work. The physical manifestation of her intelligence destroyed in a second. Then, she looked at Chloe, who was smirking, satisfied with the devastation. Something inside my gentle, kind daughter snapped. It was the accumulation of months of torment, the insults about me, the mockery of her life. Sophie didn't cry. She didn't run. She reacted with a primal defense mechanism. She lunged forward and shoved Chloe. It wasn't a fight. It was a desperate push to get the tormentor away from her. But Chloe, caught off guard, stumbled back. She tripped over her own feet and fell hard against the metal lockers lining the gym wall. She slid down, clutching her knee, and immediately started screaming, not in pain, but in performance. She attacked me. Sophie attacked me. The teachers, who had been conveniently absent during the bullying, suddenly materialized. They saw Chloe on the ground and Sophie standing over her, fists clenched, surrounded by broken plastic. The narrative was written in that instant. Sophie was the aggressor. My phone rang at work. It was the school secretary, her voice clipped and severe. Miss Vivian, you need to come to Principal Vance's office immediately. There has been an incident involving violence. Sophie is being suspended. I drove to the school with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Violence? Sophie? It was impossible, but as I parked and ran toward the administration building, a heavy dread settled in my stomach. I knew, with the instinct of someone who has been targeted before, that I was walking into a trap. I wasn't just walking into a principal's office. I was walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, and the judge and jury were people who hated everything I represented. The air in Principal Leonard Vance's office felt thick, suffocating, and recycled like the oxygen had been sucked out and replaced with judgment. I walked in and immediately knew I was outnumbered. It wasn't just a meeting, it was an ambush. Chloe's parents, Mr. Marcus Thorne and Mrs. Tiffany Thorne, were already seated, occupying the space as if they owned the building's mortgage. They were dressed not for a school meeting, but for a hostile corporate takeover. Marcus, an investment banker known for his aggressive acquisitions, wore a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. He didn't look up when I entered. He just checked his platinum watch, signaling that my presence was already wasting his billable time. Beside him sat Tiffany, a fashion editor whose gaze was sharper than the stilettos she wore. She scanned me from my scuffed work flats to my messy bun, her expression curdling into a mix of pity and disgust. They looked at me like I was something they had scraped off the sole of their designer shoes. Principal Vance sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He was a man who had built his career on avoiding conflict, especially with donors like the Thornes. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Miss Vivian, thank you for coming in on such short notice. Vance stammered, clearing his throat. We have a serious situation to discuss. I didn't sit down. Adrenaline was making my hands shake, so I gripped the back of the empty chair to steady myself. I want to know why my daughter is being suspended, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Sophie has been bullied for weeks. I have sent emails. I have left voicemails. Today, her science fair entry was destroyed. She was provoked. I tried to pull out my phone to show the documentation, the dates, the times, the unanswered pleas for help, but before I could even unlock the screen, Tiffany Thorne cut me off. Enough, she said, her voice sharp and cold, like glass shattering on tile. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Let's not pretend this is about a science project. Your daughter physically assaulted mine. She shoved Chloe into a locker. That is violence, Miss Vivian. In the real world, that is assault. She was defending herself, I argued, looking at Vance for support. Chloe destroyed her work. She insulted our family. Words are not violence, Marcus interjected, his tone bored and condescending. Physical aggression is violence. And frankly, we're not surprised. I blinked, stunned by his audacity. Excuse me? Tiffany leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with something ugly and triumphant. She placed a manicured hand on the desk. It's a pattern, isn't it? Children who lack structure, who don't have a stable home life, tend to act out. Chloe told us all about Sophie's situation. No father figures. Just you, scrambling to make ends meet. She let the silence hang there, heavy and toxic. Clearly, you are overwhelmed, Tiffany continued, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. Some women just aren't equipped to raise children alone. Without a strong male influence to teach discipline, girls like Sophie become feral. The room started spinning. This wasn't about the push. This wasn't about the science fair. This was a character assassination. They were putting my life on trial. They were judging my late shifts, my single status, my refusal to marry for money. They were weaponizing my independence and calling it negligence. Principal Vance nodded weakly, terrified of contradicting them. The board has a zero-tolerance policy for violence, Miss Vivian, regardless of the antecedents. Antecedents? I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. You mean the bullying you ignored? Marcus sighed, reaching into his leather briefcase. We are willing to be generous, Miss Vivian. We could involve the police. We could press charges for assault and sue for emotional distress. Chloe is very traumatized. He paused, waiting for the threat to sink in. But we're willing to let this go without destroying your daughter's permanent record. If you sign this. Marcus slid a single sheet of crisp, heavy paper across the desk. It wasn't a school form. It was a typed document, drafted by a lawyer. I looked down at the words, and my stomach turned. It was a letter of apology, but it was so much more than that. It was a confession. It required me to admit that I had failed as a parent, that my inadequate home environment and lack of supervision had caused Sophie's aggression. It demanded that I take full responsibility for being a bad mother, and that I agreed to enroll Sophie in mandatory behavioral therapy at my own expense. You want me to sign a statement saying I'm a bad mother? My voice cracked. I felt small, stripped of all my defenses. We want you to take accountability, Tiffany said sweetly, tilting her head. And maybe consider some parenting classes. A male role model program, perhaps? Children need fathers, Miss Vivian. That's just biology. You can't fight nature. Principal Vance finally spoke up, looking at the floor. Miss Vivian, until you sign this apology and demonstrate remorse, Sophie will remain suspended. We can't allow violent students back on campus without assurances. I sat there frozen, humiliated, gutted. They weren't just punishing Sophie. They were punishing me for every choice I'd ever made. For getting pregnant by a musician who left. For refusing my stepfather's money. For thinking I could survive in this world without a man's protection. They were saying the cruelty I endured was my fault. And now, My daughter was paying the price. I didn't sign it. I couldn't. My hand wouldn't move. I need time, I whispered. You have until tomorrow morning, Marcus said, snapping his briefcase shut. 9 a.m. Or we file charges. I left that office in a daze. I walked out into the parking lot, got into my 10-year-old sedan, and just sat there, shaking uncontrollably. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, gasping for air. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. When I finally got home, the apartment was quiet. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing her dress from the science fair. Her eyes were puffy, her face swollen from crying. She looked up at me with those big, wounded eyes, and she didn't ask about the suspension. She didn't ask about the principal. She asked the question that destroyed me. Mommy, she whispered, her voice breaking. Why doesn't my daddy protect me? Chloe said her dad would never let anyone hurt her. Why am I alone? That was the moment. The moment every wall I'd built crumbled into dust. I looked at my daughter, my brilliant, kind, innocent daughter, and I realized I was failing her. Not because I was single, not because I was inadequate, but because I was too proud. I was so terrified of being like my mother, so terrified of relying on a man, that I had denied Sophie the one resource that could save her. I had let my trauma become her inheritance. Sophie needed a protector. She needed proof that Tiffany Thorne's words were lies. She needed a man to stand up and show her that loyalty, protection, and love still existed. And I knew only one man who had been trying to do that for 20 years. I walked into the kitchen, my hands trembling violently, and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the contacts list. I scrolled past the coworkers, past the landlord, all the way down to a name I hadn't called in 2 decades, Arthur Sterling. I pressed the call button before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang once, twice. My heart was in my throat. What if he didn't answer? What if he finally hated me? He answered on the second ring. Vivian. His voice was older, deeper, but still steady, calm. It sounded like the hum of a powerful server room, consistent, unbreakable. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like he had been waiting for this call my entire life. I couldn't speak at first. My throat closed up. But then, looking at Sophie sobbing at the table, it all came pouring out. The bullying, the science fair, the thorns, the letter, the way they had publicly humiliated me, called me inadequate, called me a bad woman who deserved to be abandoned. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a terrifying second, I thought the connection had dropped. Then, Arthur's voice came back. But it wasn't warm anymore. It was ice. It was the voice of a man who built empires and destroyed competitors. It was pure, controlled fury. Vivian, listen to me very carefully, he said. You are my daughter, Sophie is my granddaughter. Those people have made a profound miscalculation. You have not failed her. They have failed both of you. Arthur, I don't know what to do. They want me to sign. Do not sign anything, he commanded. Do not speak to anyone. I will handle this. I don't want your money. I sobbed, the old reflex kicking in. This isn't about money, he interrupted, his voice softening just a fraction. This is about family. And you have been my family since the day I married your mother. I'm sorry I let you push me away for so long, but I am not letting you face this alone. Not anymore. He told me to meet him at the school the next morning. 9 a.m. sharp. He would be there. I hung up, staring at the phone, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. I had just invited the ticking time bomb back into my life, but for the first time, I realized maybe the bomb wasn't meant for me. Maybe it was meant for the people trying to hurt us. That night, sleep was an impossible equation I couldn't solve. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last 24 hours. Every cruel word from Tiffany Thorne, every dismissive glance from Marcus, every tear that had fallen from Sophie's eyes. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. What had I just done? I had summoned a ghost from my past, a man I had spent my entire adult life running away from. Would he actually show up? Or was this going to be the final, crushing disappointment? One more man who promised protection and delivered absence. By morning, the anxiety was vibrating under my skin. I dressed with trembling hands, choosing my best blazer armor for the battle ahead. I made Sophie breakfast, but she just pushed her cereal around the bowl, too terrified to eat. "Is Grandpa really coming?" she asked, her voice small. "I've never met him." "He said he would be here," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We have to believe him." We arrived at the school at 8:45 a.m. The parking lot was filled with the usual morning chaos of parents dropping off kids, SUVs idling, and the mundane rhythm of a Tuesday. But for me, the world felt suspended in a high-contrast filter. I stood outside the administration building, clutching Sophie's hand so tight her knuckles were white. 8:50 a.m. Nothing. 8:55 a.m. Still nothing. Panic began to rise in my throat, bitter and familiar. He wasn't coming. Of course, he wasn't coming. He was a billionaire CEO. He probably had a board meeting, a merger, something more important than an estranged stepdaughter, and a schoolyard dispute. I had been a fool to hope. I looked at the glass doors of the school, preparing myself to walk in alone and sign that letter. I would destroy my pride to save my daughter. But then, at exactly 8:58 a.m., the atmosphere in the parking lot shifted. It started with a low hum, the sound of precision engineering. A sleek, matte black vehicle turned into the lot. It wasn't just a car. It was a fortress on wheels, an armored luxury SUV that looked like it belonged in a presidential motorcade. It glided through the rows of dirty minivans and sedans, like a shark swimming through a school of minnows. It pulled up directly to the curb where we were standing, ignoring the no standing zone. The driver's door opened, and a large man in a dark suit stepped out, scanning the area. He moved to the back door and opened it, and there was Arthur Sterling. He stepped onto the pavement with the kind of grace that only comes from absolute power. He was older than I remembered. His hair was silver now, not gray, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of hard decisions. But his posture was unyielding. He wore a navy suit that fit perfectly. No tie. Looking every inch the tech tycoon who could buy and sell this entire zip code before lunch. He didn't look at the school. He didn't look at the staring parents. He looked straight at me. He walked over, his stride purposeful. I braced myself for a lecture, for an "I told you so," for some comment about how long it had been. But Arthur didn't say a word. He stopped in front of us, looked down at Sophie who was staring up at him with wide, awestruck eyes. And then he looked at me. He placed a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a hug, but it was grounding. It was an anchor. "You look tired, Vivian," he said softly. "I am," I admitted, my voice shaking. "You don't have to be tired today," he said. He looked at Sophie and offered a small, rare smile. "Hello, Sophie. I'm your grandfather. I hear you built a very impressive city." Sophie blinked. They broke it. Arthur's expression hardened, the warmth vanishing instantly. "We are going to fix it. And we are going to make sure no one ever breaks anything of yours again." He turned to me, offering his arm. "Shall we?" For the first time in 20 years, I didn't pull away. I took his arm. It felt solid, real. We walked toward the glass doors together, 3 generations united against the world. As we entered the building, the air felt different. I wasn't the single mother begging for mercy anymore. I was the daughter of a titan. And we were here for war. We walked into Principal Vance's office at 9 a.m. on the dot. The room was exactly as I had left it yesterday. Oppressive and stale. But the occupants seemed even more entrenched. The Thorns were already there, looking bored and irritated. Marcus was checking emails on his phone, and Tiffany was inspecting a cuticle. Principal Vance looked like he hadn't slept either. He was shuffling papers nervously, clearly hoping this meeting would end in 5 minutes. When the door opened, Vance didn't look up immediately. "Miss Vivian, I hope you have the signed document ready so we can—" He stopped. He saw Arthur. The color drained from Principal Vance's face so fast it looked like a medical emergency. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stood up so quickly his chair knocked against the wall behind him. Mr. Sterling?" Vance stammered. His voice was an octave higher than usual. The Thorns looked up, confused by the principal's reaction. They didn't recognize Arthur immediately. To them, he was just an older man in a nice suit, probably an attorney I had scraped together some money to hire. "Good morning, Leonard," Arthur said calmly. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His voice filled the room, authoritative and cool. "I believe we have a scheduled appointment. I didn't realize. I didn't know you were involved." Vance was sweating now. He knew exactly who Arthur was. Everyone in the administration knew. The new computer lab? The STEM wing renovation? The tablets every student received last year? That was the Sterling Foundation. Arthur wasn't just a donor. He was the financial backbone of the district's technology program. Arthur pulled out a chair for me, then one for himself. He sat down, unbuttoned his jacket, and crossed his legs. He looked at the Thorns with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a virus under a microscope. "I'm Vivian's father," Arthur stated, his gaze locking onto Marcus Thorn. "And Sophie's grandfather. I'm here to clarify the terms of this negotiation." Marcus Thorn bristled. He was used to being the biggest shark in the tank, and he didn't like the competition. He sat up straighter, adjusting his tie. "I see. Well, Mr. Sterling, while it's nice that Vivian has family support, the facts remain unchanged. Your granddaughter assaulted my daughter. We have a zero-tolerance policy." Tiffany chimed in, her voice shrill. "We are simply asking for an apology and some accountability. Surely, as a successful man, you understand the need for discipline, these children from broken homes." "Stop," Arthur said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The single word sliced through Tiffany's sentence like a guillotine. Arthur turned his chair slightly to face her fully. "Mrs. Thorn, let me correct your data set. My granddaughter does not come from a broken home. She comes from a home filled with love and resilience, which is more than I can say for a child who bullies others for sport." "Excuse me?" Tiffany gasped, clutching her pearls. "I have read the emails," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I have seen the logs of the text messages your daughter sent. Fatherless, bad blood, trash. Your daughter has spent weeks psychologically tormenting mine, using deeply personal insults that she undoubtedly learned at your dinner table." "That is hearsay," Marcus snapped, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "It is documentation," Arthur countered smoothly. "And when your daughter destroyed Sophie's property, a science fair project that showed advanced engineering potential and mocked her family, Sophie defended herself. That is not violence, Mr. Thorn. That is self-preservation. That is a reaction to sustained harassment." "She pushed her!" Marcus yelled, slamming his hand on the desk. "She shoved her into a locker. And you," Arthur interrupted, his voice like steel, "have been complicit. You have spread malicious gossip about my daughter's character. You have called her inadequate. You have called her a bad woman to the school administration." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes cold and hard. "That, Mr. Thorn, is defamation, slander, and unlike you, I don't threaten with empty lawsuits. I destroy with them." The room went dead silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Arthur turned his attention back to the sweating principal. "Here is what is going to happen, Leonard. You are going to reinstate Sophie immediately. The school will issue a formal apology to Miss Vivian for failing to address the bullying despite repeated reports. The suspension will be expunged from her record." He turned back to the Thorns. "You will issue a written apology to both Vivian and Sophie, Your daughter, Chloe, will be required to attend the district's bullying intervention program. If she approaches Sophie again, I will ensure she is expelled." "You can't do that," Tiffany screeched. "We'll go to the school board. We know people." Arthur smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "I sit on the advisory committee of the school board, Mrs. Thorne. I fund the board. If you want to escalate this, please, be my guest. I will pull every grant, every scholarship, and every computer from this district by noon. And I will hold a press conference explaining exactly why, because the administration protects bullies with wealthy parents." He paused, letting the weight of his threat crush them. "So," Arthur said, opening his hands, "your choice." Principal Vance looked like he was about to faint. "Mr. Sterling, please. There's no need for that. We can resolve this. We can resolve this right now." Marcus Thorne looked at Arthur, then at Vance. He saw the fear in the principal's eyes. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was the small fish. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the panicked realization that he had picked a fight with a god. The silence that followed Arthur's ultimatum was heavy, absolute, and suffocating for everyone but us. Marcus Thorne, the man who had walked in treating me like a nuisance to be discarded, was now staring at his polished shoes, his face a mottled shade of red. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind only the pathetic reality of a bully who had finally met a bigger force. Tiffany Thorne looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Her mouth was pursed tight, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't involve humiliation. There wasn't one. Principal Vance broke the silence first, his voice trembling as he tapped frantically on his keyboard. "I am printing the reinstatement letter now, Mr. Sterling. And the apology. We will have it ready for signature in 2 minutes. "Make it 1, Arthur said, checking his watch. Andrew Thorne cleared his throat, his voice devoid of its earlier bluster. We will speak to Chloe. This behavior is unacceptable. We didn't know the full context. You knew exactly what you chose to know." Arthur corrected him, standing up. "You chose to believe that a single mother and her daughter were easy targets. You were wrong. Let this be a lesson you teach your daughter. Kindness is not a weakness, and cruelty always has a cost." 20 minutes later, I walked out of that office holding a signed letter of formal apology from the school district, a reinstatement order for Sophie, and a written admission of fault from the Thornes. But more importantly, I walked out with my head held high. The walk to the parking lot felt different than the walk in. The air tasted sweeter. The sun seemed brighter. The weight of judgment, the crushing pressure of being not enough, had vanished. We reached Arthur's armored SUV. The driver opened the door, but Arthur didn't get in immediately. He turned to me, and the steel tycoon persona softened back into the man who had tried to be my father for 20 years. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. Not tears of pain this time, but of release. "I'm so sorry, Arthur. For everything. For pushing you away. For being so stubborn. I was so scared." Arthur reached out and pulled me into a hug. It was the first time I had let him hug me since I was a teenager. He smelled like cedar and safety. "You don't have to apologize, Vivian. You were protecting yourself. You were surviving. I know I'm not your biological father. I know I can never replace what you lost." I pulled back and looked him in the eye. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You're right. You're not my biological father. Robert was my biological father and he left. You stayed. You showed up. You fought for us. That makes you my dad." Arthur's eyes shimmered with emotion. He swallowed hard, nodding once. Then he looked down at Sophie, who was clutching the reinstatement letter like a shield. "And you," Arthur said, crouching down to be at eye level with her. "I am very sorry about your city, Sophie. It sounded magnificent." "It's ruined," Sophie said quietly. "The solar panels are all cracked." Arthur smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. Well, that's the thing about engineering, Sophie. Version 1.0 always has bugs. But version 2.0, that's where the real innovation happens. I have a garage full of spare parts, servers, and some top-tier solar cells from a project my company is working on. What do you say we go back to my place this weekend and build a metropolis that actually works? Sophie's eyes went wide. Really? You have solar cells? I have everything, Arthur said. And what I don't have, we'll build. Walking out into the sunlight that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Protected, valued, loved. The walls I had built to keep the world out had finally come down, but I wasn't defenseless. I realized that independence doesn't mean isolation. Being strong doesn't mean fighting every battle alone. Arthur didn't just win a fight for us in that office. He gave me back my dignity. He proved that family isn't about bloodlines or DNA. It isn't about who gave you life. It's about who shows up when life tries to break you. It's about the people who stand beside you when the world tells you to kneel. Martha got her school life back, and she eventually won the district science fair with Metropolis 2.0, a project she built alongside her grandfather. The Thorns transferred Chloe to a private school 3 towns over, unable to face the social fallout. And me? I finally stopped punishing myself for the sins of the men who left. I accepted the love of the father who stayed. If you think Arthur Sterling is the definition of a real father, smash that like button. If this story gave you chills, drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my shoes. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we bring you stories where justice isn't just served, it's delivered with precision. See you in the next one.